If you've been scrolling through endless lists of mini PCs, staring at rows of numbers, and wondering which one actually makes sense for your desk, you're not alone. It's easy to get lost in the hype tiny, powerful, future-proof, only to end up buying something that either sits idle because you can't fit your workflow into it, or overheats the moment you open a single Photoshop file. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. In this video, I'm going to walk through the real-world pros and cons of the MINISFORUM MS01 workstation, so you can decide whether that little box belongs in your office, your studio, or whether you should keep looking. First, let's talk about the problem most people face when they consider a mini PC. You want a small footprint, sure, but you also need enough ports to plug in your monitors, external drives, and network cables without reaching for an ugly dongle jungle. You need decent thermals so the machine doesn't sound like a kitchen blender every time you render a video. And you want upgrade paths that actually exist: extra SSD slots, the ability to add a graphics card if your workload outgrows the integrated GPU. The MS01 tries to hit all of those marks, but the question is how well it does it in everyday use. The chassis itself is about the size of a shoebox, so it fits nicely on a crowded desk or even on a monitor shelf. That's a big win if you're juggling a laptop, a drawing tablet, and a coffee mug. The front and rear panel layout is logical. 2 USB 4 ports right where you'd expect them, a HDMI 2.1 output, and 2 additional USB-C ports that double as DisplayPort. For someone who runs a dual monitor setup with a 4K primary display, you can hook the HDMI straight to the TV and the USB-C/DisplayPort to a monitor with a simple cable. No extra adapters, no fiddling with settings. Networking is where this little workstation really flexes. It comes with 2 10GB SFP Plus ports, a rarity in the mini PC world. If you work in a small office or a home studio with a 10 gigabits Ethernet backbone, you can plug straight into the switch and get blazing file transfer speeds for raw footage or large datasets. For anyone who only needs Wi-Fi or a standard 1 gigabit LAN, those ports might feel like overkill, but they future-proof the box for a few years. Under the hood sits Intel's 13th Gen i9-13900H. In a desktop, that chip would be a workhorse for anything from video encoding to compiling code. And in this mini form factor, it still feels surprisingly brisk. I ran a series of typical creative tasks, opening a 30 gigabytes After Effects project, scrubbing through a 4K Premiere timeline, and launching several Docker containers at once. The system didn't stumble. Load times were comparable to a mid-tower workstation with a similar CPU. The 32 gigabytes of DDR5 5200 RAM gives you headroom for multitasking, and the 1 terabyte NVMe SSD boots Windows in under 10 seconds and shaves minutes off large file copies. One of the biggest practical strengths is the 3 M.2 slots. You can start with the 1 terabyte drive that ships in the box, add a second SSD for a dedicated scratch disk, and even slot in a third one for a massive media archive. The conversion adapter for U.2 means you can drop in an enterprise-grade drive if you need that extra reliability. In my experience, this flexibility is rare in mini PCs. Most only give you a single SSD slot and a tiny SATA bay. Now for the realistic downsides. The i9-13900H is a power-hungry part, and squeezing it into a compact case inevitably raises thermal concerns. The MS01 uses a single 92mm fan that spins up to around 2,800 revolutions per minute under sustained load. In a quiet office, you'll hear a low whine that becomes more noticeable when you're rendering a 4K export. It's not a full-blown roar, but if you need absolute silence for a podcast recording, you'll have to consider a sound-absorbing enclosure or a placement far from the mic. Temperature readings from community forums suggest the CPU stays in the mid-80 SC under heavy tasks, safe, but hotter than a typical tower with a larger heatsink. Another point to weigh is the lack of an internal GPU slot. The spec sheet mentions support for discrete graphics cards, but that's limited to external GPU enclosures via the USB/Thunderbolt compatible ports. If your workflow eventually demands a high-end GPU for real-time 3D rendering or intensive gaming, you'll need to buy an external GPU box, which adds cost and reduces the pure compact advantage. For most video editors, the integrated graphics are enough for color grading and playback, but power users should keep that limitation in mind. Price-wise, The MS-01 sits in the premium range for